If you were somehow unaware, Warhammer 40K is an absolutely massive franchise that is built upon 30 years worth of lore, including literally hundreds of published novels. This can make it pretty intimidating for new people to get into, but even more so, it's led to an absolutely ludicrous amount of misconceptions about its lore, even within its established fan base. And if I'm being honest with you, when I first started as a Warhammer content creator, I was guilty of helping spread that misinformation. So don't worry, I'm gonna hold myself accountable in this video, we're gonna get into it. But more importantly, in this video, I want to clear up 8 of the biggest misconceptions that people have about Warhammer's lore. We're going to be talking about a tank the size of a house that, for some reason, a good portion of the fan base believes was originally designed to be a scouting vehicle. We're going to talk about how people believe that everything an orc believes suddenly becomes real, even though there's no canonical evidence to support this. We're even going to be diving into the mystery surrounding Space Marine dangly bits. Oh yeah, and real quick, the holiday theme merch is still available on my merch store. So go to shop.weshammer.com if you want to pick up one of these amazing shirts for yourself. But be quick because realistically, it's probably not going to be around forever. Before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video, Watcher of Realms. Today's video is sponsored by Watcher of Realms, an amazing new free-to-play strategy game on mobile and PC that features an absolute ton of unique and powerful heroes to collect and battle with. Watcher of Realms brings a 360-degree real-time battlefield, where you'll have to think on your feet and harness your hero's powerful active abilities to defend against enemies attacking from land, water, and sky. Matches are fast-paced, intense, and easy to pick up and play, so you can get a perfect strategy gaming experience anytime, anywhere. And not to mention, unlock an epic treasure trove of rewards. Rare gear, experience, potions, gold, it's all in here. I'm a big fan of how the game never skimps on giving players access to powerful heroes for free, and many of them being able to be obtained in the earliest stages, with high legendary drop rates. Plus, the game has a great user-friendly system for one-click upgrades and gear equips, meaning more time playing and less time grinding. There's a ton happening in Watcher of Realms right now, including a new camp, heroes, game modes, and even a Christmas event with dazzling rewards, as well as a new legendary hero and skin for free. Discover the Supreme Arbiters faction and tackle Boss Rush mode for an extra layer of strategic fun. Join the Christmas Showdown, famous content creators, epic battles, and team honors. The link is in the description. Pick your side and let the games begin. Returning players, the game has you covered. There's a ton of rare resources and items just for you. It is the season to come back. Don't miss out, a new experience awaits. Dive into Watcher of Realms today by clicking on my link in the description to download the game for free today, and I'll see you in the realms. Big thanks to Watcher of Realms for sponsoring this video. Number 8. All of the Space Marines have their junk removed. So the grimdark mysteries of Warhammer 40K are by far my favorite thing about this franchise, and I've dedicated a pretty considerable amount of time and effort to shedding light on the more obscure ones through my Grimdark Mystery series. However, it's come to my attention that there's one mystery in particular that's not a mystery at all, but for some reason I get comments asking me about it just about every other day. And that mystery, quite simply, is, what's the situation with a Space Marine's dick and balls? What do they look like? Are they castrated? Can they have sex? What's going on with their downstairs? And hey, if you know the answer to this one, it may seem like a frivolous mystery to you, but that doesn't matter. The people need answers, and I take my job as a lore content creator very seriously. So let's get to the bottom of this. So for some reason, a lot of people seem to think that Space Marines are castrated, that their junk is removed as part of the process to make them into hyper-efficient super soldiers. This isn't true. Space Marines still have intact dangly bits. There's no evidence to suggest that it is removed during their creation, and if you think about it, even for just a second, if you're trying to create super soldiers, removing the body's primary method of creating testosterone doesn't make any kind of logical sense. What is, however, true is that Space Marines are subjected to ruthless hypno-conditioning, part of which kills all sexual desire. All of that energy is instead redirected partly through their conditioning and partly through their genetic augmentation into biological processes that make them into more efficient killing machines. There's a pretty famous or infamous scene, depending on who you ask, in the novel The Emperor's Gift, wherein there's a co-ed shower situation between some Grey Knights and Inquisitorial agents, wherein one of the female Inquisition agents remarks that it's quite a shame that one of these men in particular had been accepted into knighthood, insinuating that he was quite attractive and had a bangin' body. The knight in question didn't understand why this woman was acting the way that she was, and it took one of his superiors explaining the situation to him for it all to click, that she wanted to jump his bones, as sexual desire was something that was a completely foreign concept to him and all of his brothers. But that didn't mean that they didn't still have their junk. At no part during this scene does this woman indicate that this guy surely is attractive for a eunuch. It's implied that everything is still there. At one point, Fabius Bile gives us a little bit of insight into this in one of his short stories, that the removal of all sexual desire from the Space Marines was a feature and not a bug. That in the Emperor's infinite wisdom, he didn't want the Space Marines to replace humanity. He wanted them to be a tool to uplift and serve mankind. If they were capable of reproducing, then they very well may end up replacing us rather than serving us. This is the main reason why he decided that they shouldn't have a sex drive. And although we don't have a direct source that explicitly states this, it is assumed that Space Marines are sterile. It's a widely held belief that if they were able to override all of their hypno-conditioning and actually have sex, they still wouldn't be able to reproduce. This is Future West doing a quick edit here. As I was putting this video together, I actually did manage to track down the source of this. It comes from Book 7 of the Horus Heresy Black Books, Inferno, on page 113, where it says explicitly for Space Marines and Custodians that they are made sterile as a form of biological control, and are thus incapable of procreation. Anyways, back to the video. Now, I've heard multiple people say that Space Marines by and large don't have sex, but the Space Wolves claim that they still do. And as far as I can tell, this comes from a single quote from Lucas the Trickster, where he seems to be implying that he routinely sleeps with people from the different tribes of Fenris. But it's not really something that's heavily focused on, and he most likely had just been joking around. But if anybody knows of a source that adds a little bit more insight into this, it's part of my job to know these things, so please share them in the comment section. So in conclusions, Space Marines still have their junk, they're not castrated, but they don't have sex, and are most likely sterile. Number 7. The Imperium uses Exterminatus to solve all of their problems. A lot of people seem to think that the Imperium will declare Exterminatus on a planet for just about any conceivable A lot of people seem to think that the Imperium will declare Exterminatus on a planet for just about any conceivable reason. Even if somebody so much as sneezes in heresy, the Inquisition will bomb the planet into oblivion. This couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Exterminatus is an absolute last resort, and any Inquisitor, rogue trader, or anyone else who has the authority to issue Exterminatus will be subject to extremely invasive and thorough investigations after doing so. There's actually an entire minor ordo of the Inquisition known as Ordo Ex Corum that exists solely to investigate the use of Exterminatus. And you have to think of it like this: the Imperium absolutely does not want any of its worlds destroyed. Not just because you would literally be killing billions of innocent people, but from a more practical standpoint, that world has a purpose in the macroeconomic scheme of the Imperium. Whether it be a mining world, agri world, hive world, or manufacturing world. To surrender it for destruction through Exterminatus is to lose all of the production and resources that it would generate. And the Imperium doesn't want that to happen. Exterminatus is only utilized when the world continuing to exist is seen as a net negative for the Imperium, that the chaos, corruption, or Xenos infection has run so deep that the planet now exists as a major threat to all other worlds in the surrounding sector, that through Exterminatus it must be excised like a cancer in order to keep the Imperium alive. And then even still, the Imperium will exhaust every conceivable resource, strategy, and tactic to prevent Exterminatus from being used. Hell, they've been fighting over planets like Armageddon for what feels like 1 billion years now, rather than just blowing it up and being done with it. Now, that being said, we do have many examples in the overall narrative of Warhammer 40K where Exterminatus has been used seemingly flippantly by radical inquisitors or mad ecclesiarchs, such as Vandire during the Reign of Blood, or the Inquisitor who was blowing up planets left and right during the Months of Shame. But in the handful of examples that we have where Exterminatus is used in such a way, the story always conveys to us as the audience that the person doing this is a madman, an insane individual that has become unbelievably corrupted. So, long story short, Exterminatus, although being one of the most quintessential things in all of Warhammer 40K, is done extremely rarely. Number 6. A guardsman's average life expectancy is 15 hours. So the source of this one is from a novel by Mitchell Scanlon titled 15 Hours, wherein we follow a 17-year-old kid who has just joined the Astra Militarum and has to go into his very first war against the orcs. Now, it is said that on this battlefield in particular, it is so dangerous that the average guardsman only lasts about 15 hours. This is an example of a piece of lore being technically true, but only in one very specific context. What ends up happening, however, is the fact that a guardsman's life expectancy on this one planet is 15 hours is taken out of context and applied with a broad brush to the entirety of the Warhammer setting. And we suddenly have a bunch of people believing that every guardsman, no matter what planet they're on or where they happen to be in the galaxy, has a life expectancy of only 15 hours, which is not true. Now, I'll fully admit that this is one of those things that I actually personally believed to be true for a really long time until I had a friend of mine who knows a lot more about the Guard than I do clear this one up for me. Not gonna make any excuses. Sometimes the memes and misinformation confuse people whose job it is to make lore content as well. We're not immune to it, just like nobody else is. Number 5, the Hammerhead's Railcannon fires at 2% of the speed of light. This is a misconception that I've seen passed around Warhammer circles for the last 20 years. Admittedly, not as frequently as back in the day, but it still pops up from time to time. Now, a little while ago, I was making a top 10 Warhammer tanks video. It was just meant to be this quick little top 10 list. I should have been able to knock it out in a day or so. However, when I went to talk about the Hammerhead, I came across this fact that their rail cannon fires at 2% of the speed of light, and I thought it sounded like a really cool little interesting tidbit to include in the video. However, when I make videos like this, I have to track down the original source of every single thing that I say. I don't want to be spreading misinformation, and I also want to confirm that the things that I think I know, I actually know. However, I ended up spending 3 days trying to find the source of this particular fact, and ended up coming up empty-handed. From what I can tell, the only source that says that they fire at 2% of the speed of light is a single line in the fan wiki that, of course, goes uncredited. The only thing even remotely close to this that I was able to find was an entry for the broadsides in the Deathwatch RPG book that says that their rail cannons fire at speeds of around Mach 5. For reference, 2% of the speed of light is equivalent to about Mach 17,480.6. It's a pretty big difference. Now, I'm no physicist, so take this with a grain of salt, but I looked into this a little bit further to see what would happen if a rail cannon was actually capable of firing projectiles at this speed, and it was nothing short of thermonuclear annihilation. The thing firing it would explode and take out all of their allies and everything in the surrounding area, and then the shot itself would detonate the other half of the planet. So yeah, the Hammerhead rail cannon does not fire at 2% the speed of light. It most likely fires at speeds somewhere between Mach 5 and Mach 15. But 2% of the speed of light is just some made-up nonsense. Number 4, the difference between the warp and the Eye of Terror. Now, this is one that doesn't really come up in conversations all too often, but I found that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Eye of Terror actually is that a lot of people in the Warhammer community, even people who have been into this franchise for a really long time, don't exactly understand. I'll admit that it took me about 10 years before I got a little bit curious and looked into the difference between the warp and the Eye of Terror myself before it all suddenly clicked and made sense to me. The basic confusion comes in when we talk about the warp as a realm of intangible substance that is made up of nothing but energy and raw emotion, yet we also talk about things like demonic planets, for example. How does an entire planet exist in a realm that is supposed to be made up of nothing but energy? Well, most of the time when we're talking about demonic planets or anything of physical substance within the warp, we're specifically talking about the Eye of Terror, because what the Eye of Terror is a wound in reality where both universes overlap with one another. So you've got the physical universe, which is full of tangible matter like planets, and the immaterial universe, which is the warp, which is just raw energy and emotion and doesn't have anything physical of any kind. Then you have the Eye of Terror, where both of these things overlap. If you ever hear anybody talking about demonic planets or anything like that, they're specifically talking about things that are in the Eye of Terror. Likewise, this is why whenever ships are traveling through the warp, they don't encounter any planets or anything like that. So hopefully this clears some things up for a few people. Number 3, the Baneblade was originally considered a scout vehicle. Now, this is another one of those facts that I personally believed for a really long time, until I went to make a video talking about the Baneblades and wanted to track down the source of this particular fact. As I mentioned before, whenever I find a fun, interesting fact like this, I want to know the original source that it came from so I can find a little bit more information surrounding it when I go to talk about it in a video. However, after trying to track this down for over a year now, I've not been able to find anything even remotely close to an actual source that states that the Baneblades were scout tanks during the Dark Age of technology. And we can kind of understand where this idea comes from, as the Dark Age of technology was meant to be this crazy over-the-top period, where humanity created unfathomable machines that the Imperium can only dream of today. They literally had these things called sun snuffers, which were giant coiled machines that could wrap all the way around an entire star and literally snuff it out of existence. So the idea of something like the Baneblade, a tank the size of a house being just a scout vehicle, really serves this kind of profound purpose in highlighting just how crazy this time period was. It really gets the imagination juices flowing, so to speak. But the reality is that it just doesn't make any sense. It's a giant lumbering behemoth of a vehicle with a top speed of around 18 kilometers per hour. And not to mention, it's loud as shit. There's nothing stealthy or scout-like about it in any capacity. It would be quite literally the worst scouting vehicle ever constructed. And again, a lot of people really like this fact, but I want to make it abundantly clear that in 20 years, the community has never been able to provide an actual source for this. It's just something that somebody made up at some point and it sounded plausible, so the community just kind of picked it up and ran with it. Number 2, there is no actual canon to Warhammer 40K. So this is one of the craziest, most pervasive, and ultimately incorrect takes that I've seen in the entirety of the Warhammer community. And it comes up way too often, that there is no actual established canon, that every single thing ever written about Warhammer 40K comes from an unreliable narrator, and thus we can never really be sure of what is true and what isn't. First and foremost, this is a ridiculous notion. There is a very clearly defined canon to Warhammer 40K, and I would go so far as to say that most of the things that people consider retcons are not actually retcons at all. They had been previously spoken about in a different source that the majority of the community didn't have access to. So when it was reprinted in a more common source, a lot of people assumed it was a retcon. This pretty famously happened with Abaddon the Despoiler and the destruction of Cadia, with the introduction of the Gathering Storm books. Now, I actually did a pretty comprehensive video on this exact subject, so check that out if you're interested. But the basic gist is that the community believed that all of the Black Crusades were retconned into being successes for Abaddon, because the Gathering Storm books indicated that the overall goal of each of those crusades was not the destruction of Cadia and the complete eradication of the Imperium, that each and every one of them had a smaller goal that was building towards the 13th. However, this is a storyline that has existed at least as far back as 2002, as the earliest source that I was able to find on it was the Libra Chaotica, where it very clearly states that each of these Black Crusades had a smaller objective. But most people didn't read this obscure background book, so when that information was collected and reprinted in a more common source, i.e. a major campaign book, it looked like a retcon. It looked like the information was just being pulled out of Games Workshop's ass, even though they had already previously published it in a different source 20 years ago. The other major part of this is the unreliable narrator, something that the community seems to think is used in just about everything ever written about Warhammer 40K, which couldn't be further from the truth. It has been used in the past, but only in very specific circumstances, and is nowhere near as prevalent as a large portion of the community seems to think. As somebody who's read between 100 and 150 of the novels, and that's not nearly as impressive as it sounds because realistically I've listened to the majority of them, I've fallen asleep listening to a Warhammer audiobook every night on 2x speed for like the last 6 or 7 years straight. I spend my days reading Warhammer PDFs and actually reading the books, and then I fall asleep every night listening to them. Anyways, I can tell you that the idea of the unreliable narrator has only ever come up in a very small handful of books. Probably the most obvious example being that of Alfarius and his Primarch book, where the book literally opens with Alfarius telling us that everything we're about to read is a lie, including the statement that he's lying. That is also a lie. So he's lying about lying, and he's lying about that. The whole point of this narrative style is to throw you off your game and make you question everything you're about to hear. which is totally in line with Alfarius and the Alpha Legion. Aside from a small handful of examples like this book in particular, most of the novels are not portrayed from the perspective of an unreliable narrator. They're not giving us a bunch of conflicting information designed to make us question everything like a good portion of the community seems to think. They have a very specific story to tell, and they do that very well. However, that being said, the unreliable narrator does tend to pop up in a pretty common location, and that's in the codexes. Now, the majority of the time, the codexes are written in such a way that is meant to emulate an in-universe author explaining events, characters, units, factions, etc., to other characters in-universe. So they don't always have the information that we as the audience do. Now, pretty frequently, when they talk about major events like the Horus Heresy in the codexes, the author will talk about how it was a time of myth and legend, where half of the Emperor's sons turned against the Imperium. Now, some say Magnus had the best of intentions, while others say he was manipulated by the Chaos Gods. But who can really say, as all of the records from this time have been lost to history? Can anyone really be sure of what actually happened during the Horus Heresy? And yeah, no, we can. We as the audience can. We know explicitly what happened in the Horus Heresy, because even though it was a period of only 9 years, we have over 80 novels set explaining the Horus Heresy in explicit detail to us. But if you're a person who only gets your lore from lore videos, codexes, or the other textbook-style supplements that are written by an author in-universe and you don't read the novels, then I can see why the lore of 40K seems to be kind of all over the place, as you're getting it from in-universe characters that are missing key information. So, in conclusion, there is a very firmly established canon. Retcons are incredibly rare, and most things that people think are retcons are not actually retcons. The way the lore is presented in the novels and the codexes is completely different, and if you're not already reading the novels, you definitely should be. They're amazing. And if you're a person that doesn't like to read, go with the audiobooks. The narrators that they get to do the Warhammer audiobooks are fantastic. Don't worry about trying to pick the absolute perfect starting point, just grab a book and dive in. Pick one that's based on a character or faction that you find interesting, rather than picking a book because you think it's a better starting point. It's kind of like trying to get into the Marvel or DC universe. You don't need to read Spider-Man #1 to start reading Spider-Man comics. Number 1. Whatever an orc believes becomes real. Okay, so let's break this down and make it as simple as possible to just kind of nip this whole thing in the butt once and for all. The orcs cannot just believe whatever they want into existence. The over-exaggeration of their abilities is probably Warhammer 40K's most famous meme. And while most people who have been into Warhammer 40K for a long time may be aware of this fact, most of them are not aware of just how over-exaggerated it actually is. In fact, what you'll often find in the Warhammer community is a group of enlightened players that insist that the orc abilities are all over-exaggerated. Then they go on to give several examples of how it actually works, only for said examples to not actually be canon at all. Orcs believing they were a tank and thus they became a tank? That's ridiculous and never happened. But let me tell you all about how orc guns work, and they never run out of ammunition because they don't think they need to reload. Here's the bottom line about orcs. If you ever hear somebody quote a fact about the orcs, believing something to be true, and thus it is, no matter how ridiculous or seemingly at least a little bit grounded in reality it might be, it's bullshit. It's not real, it's not canon. The idea that the orcs have a bunch of crazy beliefs comes up in their lore pretty frequently, but we don't have any actual canonical examples of those beliefs becoming real. There's only one exception to this, and that being that the orcs believe that vehicles painted red go faster, and thus they seem to actually go faster. But even the original source on this one is often taken out of context and requires a more thorough examination. So we can look no further than page 10 of the 4th edition Orc Codex, wherein the author of this particular segment, Gentor Lucas Anzian of the Adeptus Mechanicus, tries to explain how orc technology seems to work in his own personal opinion. Many captured orc weapons and items of equipment do not work unless wielded by an orc. I theorize that many orc inventions work because the orcs themselves think that they should work. The strong telekinetic abilities of the orc subconscious somehow ensure they function as desired. This is an actual prime example of where most misconceptions about Warhammer's lore come from, in that this is an example of somebody in-universe explaining to other people in-universe how something may or may not work. It is not Games Workshop telling us as the audience explicitly how it works. It is writing designed to be immersive more so than factual. And that's something really important to bear in mind when getting your lore from the codexes specifically. What we know about the orcs is that they somehow are capable of making technology that, to the Imperium, doesn't seem like it should be able to function, yet it somehow does. This is because the orcs were created by the Old Ones as the ultimate warrior race to fight alongside the Eldar against the Necrons and the Catan during the War in Heaven. These ultimate warriors would need to be self-reliant to a ridiculous scale. The true genius of what the orcs are is that they're a species that could show up on a planet with nothing, grab a bunch of scrap metal, some rocks, twigs, and some duct tape, and create plasma reactors out of it. And the knowledge needed to create all of these wondrous devices was hardwired into their genetic code. They don't have to spend an entire lifetime researching how this stuff works in order to make them, they just fundamentally know how to do it. It's quite literally an entire species of MacGyvers. It's not that the orcs' seemingly ramshackle devices only work because they believe they do, they quite literally work because the engineering behind it is sound. It's just not particularly pretty to look at. I don't have an exact source on this, so take it with a grain of salt, but my personal belief is that the reason red vehicles go faster is that whatever particular set of knowledge and engineering was used to construct those vehicles, the orcs subconsciously paint those ones red. It's not that the red paint itself is making them go faster, it's that that vehicle in particular was designed to be faster than the other ones and they instinctively paint it red. Now, on the surface, the orcs may not realize what they're doing. They might not understand that they're actually genius engineers, as again, this information is said to be hardwired into them at a genetic level and done instinctively. So from the mech boy's perspective, he may be experimenting, slapping a whole bunch of random stuff together to see what happens, but buried away in the back of his mind is the knowledge that when these elements are combined, there is a certain enhanced effect that can be expected. We actually get a pretty good example of this from the Rogue Trader RPG, and specifically the Explorer's Handbook Into the Storm. There's a section on making orc player characters, and one of the options that the players have available to them is to create a mech boy. This is what that book had to say. As with much of orc knowledge, the technical skill possessed by the mech boys is innate, found within their genetics, more an instinctive talent than a learned skill. In spite of this, or perhaps because of it, orc technology at its peak, normally when mech boys are at their most inspired and erratic, is able to accomplish things that human science struggles to achieve. The ramshackled appearance and unstable mechanisms used in the most sophisticated of orc devices, which are normally used by mech boys as well, as few other orcs have the patience or inclination to figure out how such things work, seem not to hinder their function. Yet, when examined by the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, are built in such a way that while the science behind their creation is sound, the device should not function at all due to a variety of crucial flaws and defects. Later on in the book, we find a talent that they can take called Worky Gubbins, and it reads as follows. The orc has an innate and instinctive skill with machinery, allowing him to perform feats of engineering that defy logic, cobbling together random lumps of wrecked technology and scrap metal into something bizarre and startlingly effective. If you're curious what this feat actually does in the RPG, it makes it so all orc weapons that have the unreliable trait are suddenly counted as reliable weapons when used by the orc in particular. A lot of people will also point to the Gestalt psychic field, known as the Wa field, that is generated when a bunch of orcs get together, as the source for their belief-based powers. But traditionally speaking, there's no evidence to support this either. The psychic field has nothing to do with them believing things to be real and thus they are. It has no bearing on their technology working, and is a completely separate thing. But as the fandom is wont to do, the orcs' powers of belief, their psychic field giving them remarkable abilities, and the Imperium not understanding how their technology works, thus declaring it some type of magic, all gets coupled together into this weird mismatch of incorrect information. So, in conclusion, Wa energy has nothing to do with making their technology work. Their technology works because it quite literally does. The Imperium just doesn't understand their technology. And the orcs can't just believe things into existence. I'll go one step further and say that there isn't actually any canonical evidence at all that the orcs have any kind of belief-based powers. Pretty much every example that exists can be chalked down to somebody in-universe just not understanding how they work. But again, a lot of this is left purposefully cryptic and vague because that's fun. It's not fun when something is thoroughly explained into oblivion. The mystery is what is engaging. So I'd ask that if you're one of those enlightened few who actually know how the orc powers work, and you see people memeing about the orcs and having fun, just let people enjoy things. You don't need to prove that you're smarter than them by coming in and putting your foot down on everybody's fun and correcting everyone and telling them that they're wrong. Nobody likes that guy. I've always stood by the policy that if somebody comes to me specifically asking me to clarify something for them, then I'll tell them that, yeah, that thing that you think is true isn't actually true. But if I just see them making orc memes and things like that, I just kind of keep my mouth shut. I like seeing people have fun with Warhammer. I don't need to come in and just tell them that they're wrong. With all that said, I do need to take a minute here to take some responsibility, as I'm personally guilty of spreading orc misinformation. If you didn't know, before I started this YouTube channel, I got my start as a content creator over on TikTok, making these quick 30 to 60 second Warhammer lore videos. Now, at one point early in my career, when I had a much smaller audience, I made a series of orc shitposts called Definitely True Facts About Orcs. The joke was that all of these facts were not in fact facts, and were just ridiculous memes. My audience at the time, who understood me, my sense of humor, and what my videos were like, were in on the joke and got what I was going for. I was doing a deadpan delivery, I put asterisks all over true and facts, and if you needed it spelled out even further for you, the second to last fact was that it's impossible to tell what's true and what isn't with the orcs anymore, as people have been making up stories about them for years, and all of them just sound so damn believable. Anyways, here's the final fact, the most ridiculous one of the bunch, where a bunch of orcs believed themselves into being a tank.
Follow for more dumb but definitely canon orc facts.
I thought the joke was obvious, but it went over a lot of people's heads. Now, here's the thing. When you make content on the internet, you have no control over what posts are going to go viral. You could put your heart and soul and a year's worth of research into a video, only for the algorithm to not pick it up, and then it doesn't get any views. Then you make a shit post in 20 minutes that you don't put any effort into at all, and it goes absolutely gangbusters. That's kinda what happened with my orc videos. They got away from me and got millions of views from people who were not familiar with me or my content. These videos were a lot of people's introduction to Warhammer. They didn't know anything about it beforehand and thought that everything I was saying about the orcs was true, and thus joined the fandom through misinformation. Which, on one hand, I'm super happy that those videos got so many people into Warhammer, but I feel guilty and a certain amount of responsibility over the fact that the first things they learned about the franchise weren't true. So I've got a bunch of mixed feelings on that. At the end of the day, I don't regret making those videos. I set out to make a comedy shitpost, and that's exactly what it was. But it ended up getting seen by a lot more people than I anticipated. But I do genuinely feel bad for pushing misinformation. Nowadays with my content, I find that the actual established canon of Warhammer is far more interesting than the memes and misconceptions that people have. I actually like making videos that dispel those misconceptions a lot more than pushing them. I know this is gonna sound super nerdy, but treating Warhammer's lore like it's an academic research subject and doing it just as much respect as you would if you were writing your own thesis is actually really fun and rewarding. So when I think about it, this is probably a little bit of me trying to redeem myself for pushing misinformation in the past, making sure that all of my videos are as well researched as humanly possible, even if it means spending several extra days in the research phase of the video, just so I know for sure that everything that I'm saying, I have a direct source for it. Anyways, after all of that, what do you think the biggest misconception about Warhammer's lore is? Is there a misconception that you believed for many years until somebody cleared it up for you? What are some other big misconceptions that people have about Warhammer's lore that you'd love to hear me talk about? As there's a lot more that I couldn't fit into this video, so this might be the beginning of another series. And as always, big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I'll catch you all in the next one.